In the autumn of 1177, while Saladin's red banners darkened the southern horizon, Baldwin IV of Jerusalem strapped his rotting body into the saddle and rode out to meet him. He could not feel his hands. He could not see clearly. His physicians had already written him off. But the masked king had not come to survive. He had come to win. This was not Baldwin's first defiance. A year earlier, barely 16, he had torn up his regent's peace treaty, raided Damascus, and personally defeated Saladin's nephew on the battlefield at Baalbek, his disease invisible beneath iron armor, a sword lashed to a hand that could no longer grip it. He had since placed the warlord Reynold of Chatillon at Karak, where Reynold's raids strangled Saladin's supply lines between Egypt and Syria. Saladin had watched every move. He had counted every insult. And now, with 26,000 warriors at his back and the full Muslim world united behind his jihad, the Sultan was done watching. Jerusalem would fall, or Baldwin IV would. If stories like this make your blood run hot, welcome to the channel. We tell history like it was meant to be told, raw, real, and relentless. Hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. Let's build this army together. The war cry had been building for a decade. When Saladin seized Egypt in 1169, his enemies dismissed him, a Kurdish upstart, a general who got lucky. They would not make that mistake twice. Within 5 years, he had marched north, taken Damascus, and forced Aleppo to its knees. One by one, the fractured Muslim princes who had spent generations fighting each other instead of the Crusaders either bent the knee or disappeared. Saladin gave them a simple choice: unite under the banner of jihad, or be swept aside by it. By 1177, the transformation was complete. The man who once commanded Egypt's army now commanded the Muslim world. His supply lines stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. His war chest was full. His generals were blooded and hungry. And every Friday, from Cairo to Mosul, imams in packed mosques thundered the same sermon: Al-Quds must be liberated, Jerusalem must fall. Saladin had spent 10 years building the most unified Islamic military force since the early caliphate. He had done it methodically, ruthlessly, and with absolute patience. Now the wait was over. His army was already moving, and Jerusalem had no idea what was coming. While Saladin sharpened his sword, Jerusalem was busy cutting its own throat. Behind the holy walls, the kingdom Baldwin IV had inherited was rotting from within, and not from his disease. Count Raymond III of Tripoli, brilliant and cold-blooded, maneuvered through court politics with the patience of a man who believed the crown should have been his. Reynold of Chatillon, the volcanic lord of Karak, raided Muslim caravans with gleeful contempt for every treaty Baldwin tried to hold together, provoking Saladin with one hand while expecting Jerusalem to protect him with the other. Then came Count Philip of Flanders. The kingdom had waited months for him, fresh knights, Western steel, desperately needed reinforcements. He arrived, looked at the situation, decided it wasn't worth his trouble, and sailed home, just like that. Baldwin watched all of it from a throne he could barely sit on. 17 years old, half blind, his fingers gone to leprosy, his face hidden behind silver. He could not write his own orders. He could not ride without being strapped to his saddle. His own barons questioned whether a rotting boy king could hold Jerusalem together. They were about to find out, because Saladin wasn't waiting for them to stop arguing. November 1177. Saladin moved like a desert storm, fast, massive, and merciless. He led his Egyptian army across the Sinai with surgical precision, bypassing the Templar fortress at Gaza before its garrison could react. It was a masterstroke. The Templars, Jerusalem's most feared fighting force, were neutralized without a single sword being drawn against them, locked behind their walls, watching helplessly as 26,000 warriors poured past them into the undefended Crusader heartland. What followed was devastation. William of Tyre, writing with barely concealed horror, records the scenes that greeted Saladin's advance: villages swallowed by fire, harvests stripped, civilians fleeing north in desperate columns. Church bells rang through the night, not in celebration but in terror. Messengers rode their horses to death, carrying the same unbearable report to Jerusalem: he is coming, and nothing stands between him and the city. Saladin's generals rode back to him from every direction with identical news. The roads were empty, the fortresses were undermanned, the kingdom was paralyzed with fear and fracture. The Sultan paused, looked north toward Jerusalem's golden walls, and allowed himself to believe it. God had finally delivered the holy city into his hands. But one man in Jerusalem refused to accept that. Every sane man in Jerusalem told him not to go. His physicians, his advisors, his barons, the mathematics alone were suicidal. 375 Knights Templar under the iron-fisted Odo of Saint Amand, a threadbare handful of local infantry, and a king so ravaged by leprosy he had to be strapped into his saddle like cargo. Against 26,000, the odds weren't a gamble, they were a death sentence. Baldwin IV rode out anyway. He could not grip a sword. His hands, wrapped in cloth against their own decay, were lashed to the reins. His silver mask caught the November sun as he led his tiny force south toward Ascalon, not in retreat, but in calculated aggression. He understood something Saladin hadn't accounted for. An army moving on Jerusalem needed supply lines, and Ascalon sat directly across them like a blade at the Sultan's throat. The move forced Saladin into an impossible choice: wheel his massive army to deal with Baldwin and lose his momentum, or push toward Jerusalem and leave 375 of the most lethal knights in Christendom at his back. It was brilliant, it was desperate. And somewhere in the desert ahead, Saladin was making his decision. They carried God into battle. As Baldwin's small, desperate column pushed south toward Ascalon, something rode with them that no military ledger could quantify: the true cross. The relic that Christendom believed contained the actual wood upon which Jesus of Nazareth had been crucified was lifted from its sanctuary in Jerusalem, placed in the hands of the Bishop of Bethlehem, and carried into the field like a weapon, because for these men it was won. The Itinerarium Peregrinorum records the transformation that came over Crusader forces when the true cross was present on a battlefield. Knights who had ridden in exhausted silence straightened in their saddles. Men who had counted the enemy and done the mathematics of their own deaths stopped counting. Something replaced the fear, not recklessness, but a cold, ferocious certainty. God had not brought them to the Holy Land across 1,000 miles of ocean and desert to die forgotten in the sand. He had brought them here to win. Against 26,000 warriors, Baldwin IV had 375 knights, a handful of infantry, and that belief. It should not have been enough. But somewhere ahead, Saladin's army was marching in a long, exposed column, and they had no idea Baldwin had found them. November 25, 1177, the feast day of St. Catherine, the day the world changed. Saladin's army was strung out across miles of open ground near Montchesard, 26,000 men loose, unformed, foraging, utterly unprepared. They had seen no credible Crusader force in days. The road to Jerusalem had felt open so long they had stopped watching their flanks. They should have kept watching. Baldwin gave no speech. There was no time. Odo of Saint Amand raised the Templar banner, the bishop lifted the true cross, and 375 armored knights lowered their lances and charged. Full gallop, straight into the heart of Saladin's vanguard like a steel fist through paper. The impact was catastrophic. Ibn al-Asir, writing decades later in Al-Kamil fi al-Tariq, could barely conceal his horror. Saladin's formations didn't bend, they shattered. Panic spread through the column faster than the knights could ride. Men who had never broken in battle turned and ran. Saladin himself fled, escaping across the Sinai on a racing camel, guarded by a few hundred survivors, his magnificent army destroyed behind him. The dying king, strapped to his saddle, had just brought the mightiest general of the age to his knees. But Saladin was still alive, and he never forgot a humiliation. A lesser man would have wept. Saladin did not weep. Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad records the Sultan's return to Cairo with chilling precision: no rage, no recriminations, no generals stripped of command in humiliated fury. Saladin rode back through his gates in silence, dismounted, and went to work. The army that had fled Montchesard in chaos was rebuilt from the ground up. New recruits, fresh supplies, reinforced cavalry. Emissaries rode out across the Muslim world carrying the Sultan's personal appeals: the jihad is not finished. Jerusalem still waits. Montchesard had not broken Saladin, it had educated him. He began probing the Crusader frontier, small raids, testing responses, mapping weaknesses with the patience of a surgeon. Every skirmish taught him something. Every retreat was calculated. He was not attacking yet, he was learning. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Baldwin IV was losing a different kind of war. His eyesight was gone now. His hands, the hands he had lashed to a sword at Montchesard, were useless, blackened stumps. He governed by voice alone, dictating from a sickbed while his body consumed itself. One man was rebuilding an empire. The other was running out of time, and both of them knew it. The miracle of Montchesard could not last forever. June 1179, Saladin had finished his lessons. At the Battle of Margion, he hit the Crusader force with devastating precision, no exposed flanks, no strung-out columns, no mistakes. The Crusaders broke, and when the dust settled, Saladin held a prize worth more than territory. Odo of Saint Amand, the ferocious Grand Master of the Knights Templar, the man who had led the charge at Montchesard, was in chains. Saladin offered ransom. Odo refused. The old warrior died in a Damascus prison rather than give Saladin the satisfaction. It was the most Templar death imaginable, and it left Baldwin without his most lethal commander. Then August came. Saladin turned his attention to Jacob's Ford, the fortress Baldwin had painstakingly built on the Jordan River, positioned like a dagger aimed at Damascus. Baldwin had poured everything into it. Saladin stormed it in days, massacred its garrison, and demolished its walls stone by stone until nothing remained. The message was unmistakable. Every fortress Baldwin raised, Saladin would tear down. Every army Baldwin built, Saladin would destroy. The kingdom had no more room to absorb losses. And Baldwin IV was running out of body and time. They carried him into the council chamber on a litter. Blind, broken, his body so ravaged by leprosy that his own courtiers could not look at him directly. Baldwin IV, the masked king, the teenage boy who had strapped himself to a saddle and charged the greatest general of the age, was dying by inches in the city he had refused to surrender. And still they came to him for orders, because even now, no one in Jerusalem could replace him. William of Tyre records these final months with barely concealed grief. Baldwin knew the truth that no one around him would speak aloud. He was dying, Saladin was coming, and the men who would inherit his throne were not the men who could hold it. He appointed his young nephew as heir anyway, dictated Jerusalem's defensive preparations from his litter with the cold precision of a general, and made his peace with a future he would never see. Jerusalem still stood. After everything, the betrayals, the lost battles, the failing body, the city was still Christian. He had bought it a decade with his suffering. It would fall in 1187, 3 years after his death. But not yet, not while the masked king still breathed. Across the desert, Saladin waited. He was a patient man. History he already knew was his. It was only a matter of time.